Welcome back to another episode of Securing the Future podcast. We are real excited. We've got a guest, Dave Anderson, on our show today. We're going to be talking about the startup world. And Dave actually lives on a boat, which we're going to love to hear a little bit about your background, your lifestyle, now that you've got satellite internet everywhere you go, Dave. So as usual, we've got Ramin Lamei, my trusty co-host here. Ramin, say hello.
What's up, guys?
His classic, what's up, guys, every time. Dave, welcome, man. Dave Anderson joining us today. Thanks so much for taking your time to talk about this. We're going to talk about startups, the top 5 mistakes, I guess, and kind of errors that you notice as you advise seed to Series A, maybe Series B level companies, technology companies. So we're really excited to dig into this topic. I think some of the things that you're going to talk about today, as we were discussing, definitely align with some topics that we've already had on the show. So we're real excited to hear from you. So welcome to the show, man.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
You're welcome. So wait, let's start out. Love to have you tell a little bit of your background to the audience and why you now have moved into consulting, and then a little bit about your lifestyle living on a boat.
Yeah. So I started my career, like back in the mid '90s, kind of during the Web 1.0 whole wave. We started out doing like network and system administration, kind of what we call DevOps nowadays. Kind of rode through that whole thing, and ended up at a company where we actually had to be Sarbanes-Oxley compliant, and started learning a lot more about security, and really got a kind of big focus on that. And probably around maybe 15, 16 years ago, really shifted my career towards security. Last 2 companies I worked for like 7.5 years, 8 years, it was Greenhouse Software, and I helped build, joined there pretty early, built up the security program from the ground up, and then moved on from there to a company called MParticle, where I was the CISO for 2.5 years. And then a lot changed in the world, and ended up moving on to a sailboat that I had in New Jersey. And wintertime was coming around, and moved down to Florida, upgraded to a bigger boat, and now I spend most of my time living on my boat in the Caribbean, which is pretty. I can't complain. I'll put it that way. It's a lot of work. Boats are a lot to maintain. I'm actually not on the boat right now because it's actually going through some major repairs, but heading back out there next Tuesday.
That's awesome. I think so. You're going to be hanging out in St. Martin and changing security lives of young startups and enjoying fun in the sun at the same time. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. And because I got to have a little bit of flexibility in kind of timing and whatnot, that's why I a little over a year ago, started up TSC Security, which is a virtual CISO, fractional CISO, and kind of general cybersecurity consulting firm. So I advise clients that are mostly seed to Series B startups. I would say pretty much all of them are primarily B2B SaaS. So it's definitely a lot of interesting companies to work with.
Yeah.
Dave, I'm curious just to get it kicked off in terms of like what you're seeing in terms of engagement. When you're engaging with these companies, do you typically see that security is a focus for them?
It is and it isn't. It really depends upon the company. I was actually brought into one actually larger. They were like Series F startup, if you really call them a startup at that point, about a year ago, to kind of help them through like a risk assessment. And to be honest, they really didn't take security seriously. And I delivered the risk assessment for them and ended up working with their team a little bit. And they just kind of just decided that they really didn't want to actually do all the things I was recommending them to do. So that one, but I would say like one of the things I'm really brought in for the most of the time is SOC 2, like either advising them on getting their SOC 2, helping them through it, kind of picking up the pieces if like in the middle of a SOC 2 program implementation where they just decided they picked up like a software like a Secure Frame or Vanta or whatever, and just they get lost. They're like, oh, well, we don't really understand all these things that we need to plug into this and whatnot. So a lot of what I've done recently are those sorts of engagements. And when I come in, there's like a lot of different things that I run into. One of the biggest is a lot of these companies, they don't know the risks. And if you don't know your risks, you can't really like create and run an effective security program. because you're just kind of just shooting in the dark at that point. So one of the things that I always do with my clients, especially the ones that are bringing me in for SOC 2 and whatnot, is actually do a risk assessment. And that's basically getting a bunch of people on a Zoom or something like that for an hour, maybe 2 hours, and kind of talking through like not just the technical risks, because those are a lot easier to identify. Like, what are the operational risks? Like, what are like the areas of risk around fraud? Do you have like I'm sure anybody that works in a corporate environment today has gotten a text message or email that's supposed to be from their CEO. Like, what is like, how do you approach those sorts of things? So like, that's one of the biggest areas that we work on. And it's very eye-opening generally for a lot of people when they realize that I was like, oh, we didn't really think about all these different things. And we were focusing in this area when we really should be focusing more in this area. And it really helps them to kind of put the right investment into the right areas in protecting their business.
Yeah, and those companies are usually running really fast, right? Like a lot of the companies I've worked with are B2B SaaS. And typically when they are looking at like a head of security, in my recruiting background, they have data of very high consequence, right? And so that's one of the reasons why they're needing to, truly assess the security of their system. But you're right. I think the number one, right? We're going to have five today, folks. We've got number one is know your risks. That's a big one. And I think it's a lot of organizations, because you're running fast, you're moving things into production, you want to build a profitable product, and you're also trying to win those big whale customers, right? And usually you've got these really long questionnaires that are coming in on a regular basis, and they're like, we can't handle this. We need to go for our SOC 2, at least to get some of these questions off the plate of the IT person usually, right? So I don't know, does that resonate with what you step into when you like, what's the number two thing? Like, what is it after that as you're assessing risks? Like, what do you get to next?
Yeah, the next one is not investing in IT. One of the things, when you're a small startup, you're 10, 15 people. Yeah, you're not thinking about like, okay, how do we manage our laptops at scale? How do we like manage all of our software as a service? Like your Slack, your Google Workspace, like all the other, like the 15 different project management tools that are out there. And trust me, one of my companies, we had 15 project management tools that people used. The term shadow IT, where they're talking about people going and just signing up for services because it's just a particular tool that they may want to use. Sometimes it's free, sometimes it's not, and they just put it on, and it's not, it just goes on the corporate card, or they just expense it or whatever. The Getting those things under control are really important, especially like these third-party services, because number one, if you don't know about it, you can't vet it. You don't know that your data is going there. You don't know if your customer data is going there. You don't know, like, have any control over it. It's not in your single sign-on if you're using single sign-on. It's not in your risk assessment. You don't know, like, okay, is this a risky service? Do we trust this company, this third-party company, be able to handle our data? So, and those things are hard to do. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you assess that. There's plenty of tools out there. I actually was on a podcast probably like 6 months ago for one company that actually has a tool that's really helpful for figuring out what your SaaS security posture is. But that's another area where if it's not difficult to do these things, and if you're like a seed or Series A startup, hiring a IT person, I mean, it can be expensive. You may not need a full-time IT person. So it's one of those juggling acts. You have to figure out when the right time is to pull the trigger on that. And it's generally, in my experience, is when you kind of get to that kind of 50 people, that between like 35 to 50 people range. Because especially you're starting to get to that point where a lot of times, especially with your Series A, you're starting to actually like get hiring at a higher pace.
Yeah.
And that's the best time to get these things taken care of. So you're set up for scalability, you're set up for security and whatever, because if you don't do security early, it's much more expensive and much harder to do it later.
And I like how you're highlighting, not all security is directly, within security tools and controls. It's looking for other, departments and functions like IT, right? And if you have a good IT department and function and process and procedures, right, you're going to be more, more on the path to become secure, right? It's when you're missing these kinds of functions early in a company's life cycle where you don't, just like you say, you don't have it at the right time. It's just going to become more expensive to add on in the future. You have to
Yeah.
go back and fit it in. I was doing an assessment for a company very similar to a post Series A, but they were larger. So they were looking to actually raise for Series B, but they were much larger. A lot more time had passed. And I came in and looked at, essentially their program, the whole company, and did an assessment. And one of the things that stuck out to the executives that they were shocked about was they were missing IT. And they're like, why is this coming up in a security assessment? Well, a lot of these controls, the security looks for are maintained by IT. And when you don't have IT and you think maybe you have a managed services and they're just going to do everything for you, there's misunderstanding there, right? You're making assumptions that aren't actually accurate. So a lot of my efforts there were to kind of just educate, what can you expect out of a managed service provider? If you're going to have your own IT staff, what can you expect from them? Especially around things like monitoring of their services. They expected the managed service provider was doing monitoring up and down their stack. And it was eye-opening to share with them. They're not. They're doing, is the disk running, is your CPU max, but they're not looking at your database queries. They're not seeing those things time out. They're not looking at your website. They're not seeing, traffic going there. So a lot of that, it was educating was really the key focus of what I needed to kind of message to them after the assessment.
Yeah, and it's not an accident that most times a lot of startups when they hire their first security hire, IT ends up reporting to them, or IT becomes their responsibility because there's no one else doing it. Right? And that actually happened. That's more often than not. And I mean, and IT is like a fitting under security. I mean, to be honest, I mean, I have opinions in both camps, but they're definitely for a startup. I think it definitely is beneficial for IT to be under security because there are so many security controls that are managed by IT. So I mean, and yeah, it's like you have to deal with onboarding and offboarding, and you have to deal with like just knowing what kind of SaaS applications are out there, what other like making sure the MDM is on all the laptops that people have, and knowing how to be able to if someone leaves the company, that you're doing the remote wipe on their email account off their phone and stuff like that. So having and knowing where the data is, and that's just on the corporate side. That doesn't have anything to do with your product or
Yeah.
your service that you're providing your customers.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of work to do when you come in, right? Probably a lot of processes that need to be implemented, I would imagine. I mean,
Yeah.
it's all processes, people, technology. So process, there's just no process on how do you track these things, who's managing it, who has the policies of when an employee leaves, right? How do you wipe everything? That seems to be one that's a real big challenge for companies that just don't think about very well.
Offboarding.
Offboarding, yeah,
And that's one of the
absolutely.
reasons you need to know about all these different SaaS applications you have, because
Right.
when someone leaves the company, you're if you don't know that their data your data was sitting in this random service, you don't know to go disable that account to like change their password or something like that so they can't get back into it. I mean, the amount of data leakage that happens just because of dormant accounts and third-party services sitting around is crazy.
How about Google Docs sharing it with a personal email address? How often do you see that one? And somebody's still in
All
a
the time.
document that has like really important company information and they're on a totally different email. So you didn't think to go look at who are the users on each of these documents or have a policy where nobody's allowed to get into that document with a personal email address if they're sharing it across the company. Like those little things can really matter, right? And now that person still has access to, let's say, really important company data that could be leaked.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
I actually just did a audit for one of my clients to find out what Google Docs were actually shared outside of their company. And there were tens of thousands.
Whoa.
And yeah,
Wow.
I mean, a lot of them, to be fair, a lot of them were actually they were being shared with outside partners or outside consultants and things like that. So they were supposed to be that way.
Yeah.
But there was some that definitely like those files were not supposed to be shared with these people. Like continue to be shared with these people. Like we no longer have a contract with them. this was a project they worked on like a year ago, and lo and behold, they still have access just because it was just never tracked and no one really thought to actually like run reports like this. And unfortunately, I mean, I think unless you're using Google Workspace, like the big enterprise version or something like that and paying them a fortune, I don't think these tools actually exist for you to be able to do that without having to kind of open up terminal and do some command line. Yeah. Which
Yeah.
thankfully, like because of my like Unix administration background, I actually have the capability of doing. But that's one thing you don't really find in a lot of security leaders, to be honest. People know how to do the people process and technology, but not the deep parts of the technology.
Yeah. Yeah. And the next area, number three, what is it that, so now you've got a handle on their threat, kind of the risk posture, the risk assessment you go through, you look at what's typically next?
Vulnerability management. That is
Oh, yeah.
always a huge thing. Yeah, I mean, the amount of companies that I go into that have no idea like what vulnerabilities they have in their on their laptops, the stuff like software that might be on there, on their cloud services. So like they have let's say a aging SSH kind of bastion host that's in their AWS cloud environment that's never been patched. They never take into consideration. It's like, wait, you have this thing that's basically the gateway to your backend environment, and it could be sitting there with vulnerabilities. The Docker and containerized workloads have become a huge thing. Like there's a lot of good tooling to find the vulnerabilities in your Docker images and Docker containers, but the huge number of vulnerabilities that you actually see on those is crazy. And then you have your third-party libraries you might have in your application. There's a lot of good tooling to find the vulnerabilities, but fixing those is really tough sometimes, especially when like you have like Node.js and like any sort of like NPM type of framework that's in there that you're using, which is a core part of your application, but there's this vulnerability in the version you're using, and you end up having to upgrade your entire framework to actually fix it. And that ends up being hours, days, weeks, months of effort that is really expensive for a startup because that's when you're not doing product work. I mean, it's arguable that, yeah, I mean, keeping things secure is still product work because your customers are they're expecting you to be delivering them a secure service. But it's getting these things prioritized and identified first and prioritized is definitely tough. And even some of the most secure companies, they have trouble. They get a critical vulnerability that gets picked up by a tool, and the number one, they have to sit there and it's like, okay, are we truly vulnerable to this?
Yeah.
How do we fix it? Is it just a quick package update and test it, ship it, and we're good to go? Sometimes that works. And there's other times where it ends up breaking. They've kind of depended upon the bug, so to speak, and it ends up kind of breaking how the application actually works, and it ends up being a multi-day engineering effort in order to fix it. And during that entire time, they're potentially vulnerable to an exploit that might actually be floating around in the wild.
Wow.
It's
And
interesting as you talk about the app side, right? You're going down what a rabbit hole that could be. My mind goes back to even the IT side, right? When I hear vulnerability management, it's not just a vulnerability scanner, right? It's
mhm.
many different controls that are, especially STEM in the IT world, right? Do you know where all your assets are? Do you know, what assets are out there? And then what's installed on those assets? A lot of times, especially startups don't have a lot of configuration tools where they can see what's loaded on each system. They can remotely patch those third-party software. So, it's more than just scanning, right? It's kind of having a plan on how do I patch my systems? How do I maintain an asset inventory? How do I whitelist, blacklist, different softwares that I want allowed in my environment?
Yeah, maintaining the asset inventory is that's one of those areas if you're in the cloud, it makes it a lot easier. But if you have an office, if you have servers in your office, if you have cameras, if you have the security systems themselves, and they even have vulnerabilities. Because a lot of times the thing that runs your swipe card system for access to your office space is running on a Windows machine. And those have vulnerabilities. Yeah, you may not have them connected to your network, but maybe you do. And so, and like in your network infrastructure, there's so many different areas where there's potential vulnerability and whatnot, and it's a lot of work. I mean, vulnerability management usually ends up being probably one of the hardest things that whenever I'm advising any of the companies that I'm working with, one of the hardest things to manage. And sometimes you have to be a little forceful on it because it's like, well, we don't want to spend the money on this. It's like, well, you kind of need to. Like you're creating, that's one of those things that shows up in a risk assessment. It's like, okay, how you like unmanaged vulnerability or unpatched vulnerability is going to potentially lead to compromise. And if you look at the Verizon data breach report for like the past 10 years, it's always there. And you got any of these like major attacks or major like compromises to these like large companies. A lot of times it was an unpatched system somewhere.
And what you're highlighting there too then is like the effectiveness of your program. So it's one thing to have the tools, one thing to run the scans, but then it's like having the hygiene for, here's your vulnerabilities, here's, when you need to remediate them, who owns them, right? Who's tracking that? Who's, following up on these things? It takes bodies, it takes resources to do that, and it's expensive for startups, right? Now have to fund an IT department. Now you need to kind of fund a security resource here to just operate vulnerability management, both on the infrastructure network side, and then you got the app side. The app side's a whole nother world with a whole nother set of tools, right?
Yeah, it gets complicated. It gets very complicated very quickly. So that's usually like definitely one of the areas that I see a lot of work needing to be done.
What's the main? I think number 4. We talked a little bit before. What's the main reason that companies bring you in? I think that kind of leads to number 4.
Yeah. So I'm brought in a lot of times to help with SOC 2. And SOC 2, I mean, it's a mixed bag. I mean, honestly, I think SOC 2 is great because it's done properly. It's basic security hygiene. That's what I like to call it. Like if you actually like have a SOC 2 program, you actually follow it. You actually do it with the kind of the right thought and the right purpose, you'll be more secure than you would be without it. But if you want to just get past the audit, just a checkbox, just like kind of like only give the auditors the evidence that is good, and you have all this stuff over here that's like, it's like, no, don't look at that, then you're not doing SOC 2 right. And it's basically going to translate into one of my 4th point. Having SOC 2 doesn't mean you're secure. It means that you passed an audit. It means that you successfully convinced an auditor that you have these controls in place and that they're effective. But did you implement the controls properly? Do you know that they're doing what they're supposed to do? Are you just kind of showing? Did the auditor only ask for things related to your internal IT systems? But you have this whole product, this whole like huge AWS environment with 15 different like applications and microservices and so on and so forth running over here in this other area that the auditors need to look at. Like, wow. One of the most common things that I see is like, oh, well, the auditor wanted to see a firewall rule review. Well, you gave them your Office firewall. It's like not what they were looking for. They want to know about that too. But they want to know that you actually are looking at your cloud environment, that you have all your security groups in place, all your load balancers, like what public IP addresses do you have? Like what's your internet facing exposure? And a lot of times that stuff gets overlooked. And unfortunately, like you still get your SOC 2 audit, you still get your successful attestation with that. But when you're not doing yourself any service and you're unfortunately kind of misrepresenting yourself to your customers at that point.
Yeah, that's scary, right? I mean, look at, I don't know the details of exactly what was compromised and how, but look at Change Healthcare and how that has affected so many people's lives. I mean, it's horrible to think about how many. I mean, I'm thinking, think of your family members that needed to get a very critical prescription, and now they're waiting because the technology of this system that was people were relying on got compromised. That's a big issue. So, I mean, think of it as smaller scale, right? With these companies that you're advising, their customers might be in, similar critical, important areas. If they're health tech or fintech or
Mm-hmm.
something that, connects back, it's bad to not address those things and actually present yourself as secure when you're not.
Yeah, and I mean it's tough, and I mean because unfortunately and unfortunately, I mean SOC 2 has become table stakes for like if you're like any sort of B2B SaaS at this point, you pretty much have to have SOC 2, which is like I said, it's a mixed bag. I mean, I think it's a good thing because it gets people to think about it, but it's expensive. It's or potentially expensive. You can do it on the cheap, and generally when you do it on the cheap, that's when you're kind of potentially misrepresenting yourself. But you can still do it on the cheap and actually still have good, effective security, actually like implement the controls as they're meant to be and be able to kind of have a proper representation of what your control environment is and what your security posture is.
Dave, as you work with C to Series B, I'm curious, do you typically see any security staff members, or are you looking at generally companies that are still trying to figure out, do they need a security department, or they figured out how to do SOC 2, but they haven't really built a program beyond that? What do you typically see there?
Yeah, a lot of times, there is no security team. The people who generally are handling security or security related stuff is like the CTO and whoever the DevOps engineer is. And those generally end up being the two people that I end up working with the most. And because they're really doing the technical implementation, especially when it comes to SOC 2 and implementing a program, doing the technical implementation of those controls. And I mean, if it's secure, bringing in a full-time security hire is expensive. And
Oh yeah.
if you like to bring in a security engineer, I mean, we're talking probably 180 to $250,000 a year.
Yep.
If you want to bring in a director of security, I mean, that's probably at least that, and probably in the upwards of 300,000. And then if you want to actually hire a CISO, we're talking at least 300 to like $500,000 a year all in.
Yep.
It's a lot of money, and that's why companies bring in someone like myself, because a lot of times you don't need a full-time security hire. You need somebody to come in, help your existing internal team to get through like the various things, figure out what your kind of security strategy should be, and like your internal team to actually be able to do the implementation. And I help out with a lot of implementation and everything as well. I mean, because I do have the technical background. So, like, for one of my clients right now, I'm actually basically I was brought in because they did a reduction in force and let their security team go. So obviously they brought me in to pick up the kind of the day-to-day kind of managing security, and they had to scale down the business and everything. So I'm helping them figure out, okay, well, you don't need all this tooling. Like you had Sneak, you don't need it anymore because you don't really have anybody that's going to sit there and manage it. And you have all these other tools that like kind of do the same thing, and so on and so forth. So it's definitely challenging to do those things as a small startup.
As you talked about the different roles you need, it's important to also highlight like a startup doesn't need, like, for example, just a CISO, right? They need someone that can be hands-on,
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
in front of like the tools, setting tools up. So it's hard for them to look at like the enterprise type roles at startups. Startups need like maybe one resource, but that can do many different functions, wear many different
Mm-hmm.
hats, and be able to take on that kind of work. And if they hire a CISO early before they have any staff members, well, that's great, but who's going to do the work?
Oh, and that's why you see a lot of job posts out there for CISOs that they want to have software engineering experience, like
Yep.
DevOps experience, like know how to like, and the responsibilities are including like actually hands-on IT work and hands-on cloud security and cloud engineering work. Like it's at that point, it's not a CISO. That's like that's a security, but yeah, I mean that's really a security engineer who understands policy, I guess is really what it
That's a
comes
good way
down
to
to,
put it.
which is is what a lot of companies need, but why calling it a CISO is a little kind of a misnomer.
We do throw that term around a lot in this industry, don't
Yeah.
we? All right. So Captain Anderson, what is the final number 5 here?
So where do you go after SOC 2? And that's
Yeah.
what I had with like my clients that I'm advising once we kind of get through the SOC 2 report, and like they're all good from that perspective. They want to still continue to improve their security. And one of the next things that a lot of times doesn't really get addressed is application security. And if you're like a typical B2B or B2B SaaS, you're providing software. So
That's right.
one of the areas that like beyond doing just putting scanners and stuff like that in your continuous integration and like pipeline and stuff like that, that stuff's easy. You can just basically plug something in, and then you have to deal with a whole other set of vulnerabilities. But we won't talk about that. Is starting to do threat modeling. So what that is just basically it's like a risk assessment, but for like the features of your software. So you're writing a new piece of software, or a new feature for your web app. Think about what are the different ways that someone could abuse it. And when you're putting that thought into the initial design process, you're, as I hate to use the term, but shifting security left. It's moving it to the beginning. And when you do that, you end up saving a ton of money because instead of having to go patch some vulnerability that came up that a penetration tester found that like a year after the code was written that could end up taking days or whatnot of engineering time to actually fix. Put these things in first. Think about like, okay, an attacker, you're changing your login screen or something like that. Like how many different ways can an attacker like go at this thing? What about brute force protection? Are you doing any sort of single sign-on? Just think of all the different ways that an attacker can actually do something bad to it. And a lot of times too, the nice thing you get with that is it helps with certain classes of bugs, especially if you do test-driven development, because you can just write tests for all these different scenarios, and you end up having a more robust, more secure app with hopefully less bugs.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we've got 5 great tips for startups that, I think in this time, the need to be educated for these companies that are innovating and driving a lot of the change that we see in society, it's really helpful to take time to listen to this kind of a talk, right? And really understand some of the things you can do better early on. Dave, we always like this last question of our show is typically around the future. What do you see in your world coming up in the future here for SaaS startups that you work with that are going to be maybe new security threats, or is it going to be just the same stuff that we're seeing like we talked about? I mean, this is not rocket science, but it is things that are constant and consistent.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's usually if you're not getting the fundamentals right, it doesn't matter what the new threats are. I mean, a lot of times the new threats are just a rehash of some sort of other existing flaw or existing lack of security control. And I mean, malware is malware, but how it's getting to your system is a different way. Social engineering, I mean, I'm still blown away. That's still a considerable attack vector. And it seems to be only getting worse, and that they're getting more creative, and so that's definitely one of those areas. And to be honest, especially you mentioned Change Healthcare, they sent $20 million to those attackers. That's a huge payout,
Huge.
and that's only
Motivates
going to
them.
motivate. Yeah, it's only going to motivate more people to do more things, and like it usually ends up being they get it in very simple manners. And so, like, honestly, we got to fix the fundamentals before, like, we can really, like, focus on what the kind of the new emerging threats are. Because the new emerging threats are really just, like I said, I think it's a lot of times it's just a rehash, just some modernization of some sort of other existing thing that's been battling for years.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah,
Ramin,
to
last
kind
thoughts?
of add to that, it's important to, like you said, to get the foundation right before worrying about, what is AI going to do to my industry, right? Well, you have a security awareness program where you're educating users not to click on phishing emails and doing simulated phishing testing. That's minimal effort, right? A minimal cost, but
Hmm.
are you doing it? Like that's a good hygiene practice before you go worry about is AI, are you securing your AI models correctly?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's actually something I'm about to kick off with all my clients, offering the phishing testing for free. It's like if you're
I love
working
it.
with me, I'm just going to include that because it's just important.
Yeah.
to understand that risk vector.
Dave, the only other thing I would just highlight, and I think you talked about it, but I think it needs a highlight before we go, is when you think about how a startup makes decisions, they make decisions very quickly and they make it based on short-term and long-term things. What I've seen be a bad pattern is when they make decisions and they don't document risks and they don't revisit risks. And I've seen that
Right.
be behavior that leads towards many bad decisions that build upon themselves over time, where by the time you bring in a Dave to do a risk assessment, it's hard to unravel how this executive team has kind of got into the pattern of making decisions very quickly, but then they don't really look at the whole picture, and they've been accepting a lot of risk that they wouldn't if they knew the full picture and they knew what their options were properly, and then they
Right.
had to visit these decisions 6 months down the road. I think that's something that I struggle with educating, especially in the startup space, is think about how you're making decisions, not just the security decisions, but decisions across the board. And are you looking at these decisions short term, long term? And then are you ever revisiting your decisions and saying, did I fully understand all the risk I was taking?
Yeah, and that's a lot of times if because it's like the SOC 2. It's another example of SOC 2. You do your risk assessment to make the auditors happy, and hopefully you did a good one. But a lot of times you don't usually end up revisiting it until the next year comes around. It's time to do your SOC 2 again. You're like, oh, we had all these risks that we identified. Yeah, we put some controls in place and fixed a couple things, but there's these 5 that are just still sitting here that we never did anything with because we just didn't follow up on it.
Mm.
So having good follow up on your on risk is a huge thing. And like you have to look at and that's one of the areas where having responsibility assigned to somebody for those risks is important. Because if no one's looking at it on a constant basis, if no one's thinking about it, and it's not anybody's responsibility. And if you assign it to a group, it's still no one's responsibility. It needs to be one person. One person needs to be accountable, and that person needs to make sure they're actually doing the follow up.
And even in tech roles where you have a CTO making a lot of technology decisions, short term and long term, you almost need that accountability or that counterpart that holds him accountable. I've seen many times I come into an organization and I've seen they're 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road where bad decisions have been made because no one challenged a CTO because they weren't technical enough and saying,
Yeah.
what about this? Why did you sign off on all this tech debt? Where did you write these things down? When did you revisit to fix this properly? You don't see a lot of that, right? And those are
Yeah.
challenging, things to unravel years later, and they end up being more expensive.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, this was really good information, Dave. Thanks so much for taking time as you were land bound to join us today. Maybe we'll have you on for a follow up in the future. This was great. So definitely visit Dave, TSC Security, if you're a seed or Series A, Series B startup and you just have no security program whatsoever. Dave is just phenomenal at really helping these organizations out. And it's great to know you're doing that kind of work, Dave. I think it helps us as consumers even because we're using a lot of these apps and knowing there's somebody behind the screen that's actually making a difference to ensure security is implemented. And we do a lot of the same things here at TechCompass as well. So until next time, we'll continue to try to secure the future together. Bye, everyone.